Welcome. My motive in making this video is simply to have me saying the things that I think are important to know about inflation before we have a real discussion about anything related to inflation. Especially the broader the conversation gets, the more important it is that we're on the same page that inflation means different things and works differently in different parts of the economy because of its nature. So, again, if obviously there's not a whole lot to the video, I'm just going to be talking about it. I'm 0% offended if you are listening instead of watching. Similarly, if your learning style is such that you want to listen to me at 1.5 speed or something, not offended. I'm going to try not to speed talk too hard for those who are joining us with less economic background. And that's another thing. We're going back to basics here because the whole concern, the whole reason why I feel like I have to make this video is because it's really clear that the middle class has been lied to about economics in a lot of ways, and they're ways that matter. And I would just harken back to the idea that, you know, it has been observed for a long time by many people going back that if you um, if you incentivize certain misunderstandings, it's very hard for people to understand them the proper way. Uh, you know, it, if your paycheck depends on you not understanding something, it's going to be very difficult to incentivize you to look in the places that you'd have to find the information that would threaten to change what your right answer is on a question that's important to you. And I get that, but at the end of the day, the real world is going to slap you really hard if your model of the world is basically correct on the parts that you interface on a day-to-day basis with until there's a change. And then the change confronts you at the part of the world that you misunderstood, that you never had a reason to verify your information on. So you wouldn't really know if someone lied to you or not because you just kind of went with it. And it's been observed that people reading the newspaper will have some newspapers are so quaint these days, but I mean that's the point. It's been back way before the internet. Someone would read something and they would say, well, this is obviously incorrect. This is something that I know about, and here's how I know that this is incorrect. And then they'll read another part of the newspaper and they'll be like, oh, I'm sure it's basically correct because it's not something that they had personal knowledge of. It wasn't their field, it wasn't their specialty. So what they saw was that the media was obviously full of crap when it came to the topics that they knew about, but maybe it's mostly right for everybody else's topics that they're knowledgeable on. No. No. What there's been overwhelming evidence is that people have lost their appreciation for finding out the truth of how things actually work, and they find that their incentive structure is that it's more important to be aligned with what how the establishment says that things work, which in a democracy flavored environment is a lot like following the crowd, following the herd. Out of the herd, part of the herd that bothers to speak up, do you have a majority? That's some very fuzzy stuff there, and you're getting really far removed from the nuts and bolts of, if I call this true and I try to use it, will reality wallop me upside the head? Because that's what we care about. And that's what I want to talk about today. I'm going back to basics. It's going to be a long video, but we need to talk about what we've seen in the past about how money works, how people choose to use their money, how people choose to not use their money, and addressing directly some of the myths that have been going around regarding um, inflationary pressures, money creation, etc. So, enough with the introduction. Let's get to it. So, where we're at is US dollar exists. What's the US dollar today? The US dollar today is what's left of an older system, and it's you can't reasonably describe the current system without talking about where it came from. Well, where did it come from? So, in the United States, we have a situation where essentially, initially there we didn't have banking over here, and that people were, for the most part, cared more about goods and services than they did about currency of some sort. But once it got more established over here, then trade became a thing, and currency, of course, was the British currency. And as to a certain extent, in its earlier years, America definitely had some of this thing going on where it was just more important to have the right stuff than it was to have money. And the main use of money was that you could use it to get more stuff. And that's kind of how it should be to a certain extent, especially in an area that's underdeveloped. Makes sense. So you move forward past getting independence from Britain, and you have US dollar, and immediately you have the great debate about whether or not there should be central banking, or whether there should be banks that are independent, whether or not the banks should be able to issue paper notes of some sort, that sort of currency, whether they shouldn't. Um, Absolutely, it's a big important issue. It's the kind of thing that it doesn't confuse me that people fight wars over it. But the way that it ended up working out in the US, of course, is that they ended up politically rejecting the idea of a central bank in the 1800s, until after a bunch of other stuff happened. I'm not going to go over the huge history of the Civil War and of the sinking of the Titanic and the creation of the Federal Reserve and all that. Let's just compress that for the purpose of our conversation and fast forward to the Federal Reserve. And you have the Bretton Woods Agreement. Initially the gold standard, there's that gets mucky, and I'm not looking to speak through that debate right now. But in terms of the history of it, whatever real gold standard existed ended up getting rolled into the Bretton Woods Agreement, which was not a real gold standard. And you have all sorts of political reasons that people oppose the gold standard, and for better or worse, Nixon took us off of the gold standard. Well, okay. So what did that mean at that point? You've got all of these different banks that are going about their business notionally holding, lending, etc. Uh, notes that are backed by gold, but not really. Because remember that the Bretton Woods Agreement said, well, they're notionally backed by gold, but you want to redeem it? Unless you are the central bank of a country, like that's funny, because the central banks are only going to redeem for each other within the Bretton Woods system. And if you stop playing by the rules, then we'll just kick you out. And then we don't have to redeem your stuff in gold. So even though on paper we kept the gold standard, we didn't. We did not. And the difference in how the money behaves reflected that. Um, and there's plenty of other things that went along with that that would cause money to be spent differently, changing populations, changing who's allowed to vote, et cetera, et cetera. But at the end of the day, you still have the same basic system, which is that people were bringing in They're either literal gold or notional gold, pieces of paper that said that they were good for gold. They were they were turning them into a bank, and then they had an asset of an account that was on record at that bank. That bank owed them the money that was notionally redeemable for gold. So in people's heads, gold was still money, and the little pieces of paper were gold. They were stand-in for gold instead of dealing with all these pieces of paper. That it was like trading gold. And that's the part that I don't think I don't think that the average libertarian minded person understands how important that point is. The part of our brains that want to treat money like gold, that would not have been correct since way before we were born, right? However, because of the essentially the branding, the US dollar was essentially branded like gold, right? In the same way that people when they banned hemp, then you just switch right from making ropes out of hemp to cotton, and then like a rope is always cotton, it's never hemp because blah blah blah, right? It's one of those things where all of the sudden there was a government action that changed what was going on, and people wanted to be able to just use their same label for the same thing and keep living their life like nothing changed. Why would you want the government to change your life without you asking them to? Why would you just not let it happen? Oh, okay, yeah. So that's essentially what people did, is they didn't let it change their life because they already liked their lives and their lives kept working. There was nothing immediate about Nixon saying that we're no longer going to redeem the gold, blah blah blah, that just like flip the switch in people's heads that they're like, oh, I don't need dollars anymore. Because no, that didn't change whether or not you needed dollars, whether or not you could redeem it for gold, right? Same thing back at the creation of the Federal Reserve. People weren't in a position under legal tender laws to use something besides legal tender dollars to engage in their commerce. And they also had to, of course, at some point or another, acquire those dollars to pay taxes. And of course, the more you transacted in the dollars, like the more that you were going to need to hold on to some of them to pay taxes. And that's how the system was calibrated. For again, I'm not defending the system. We're talking about how it's set up. And that's how they got away with it, right? That's how they got away with the transition from having everybody transact in gold to having everybody transact in something that was notionally tied to gold to our current even more flexible system. Why, since Nixon, how is it that we keep a cap on the quantity of dollars? Because before Nixon, at least theoretically, it was notionally tied to this idea that our need to pay out gold when people think that the gold is worth more than the dollar would maintain the value of the dollar, right? Now, I'm going to step outside of analytic mode and give some personal opinions here because it's a big deal to me. The gold standard from the very beginning was a form of price fixing, because rather than let the value of a dollar and gold float against each other, the government took it upon themselves to make gold a special asset class that is inextricably linked to the dollar, right? Again, um, for better or worse, except that price fixing has costs and it's almost never worth its costs. Um, And when it is worth its cost, there's almost always some sort of a mitigating step that you should be taking to minimize the amount of market disruption it makes, because it's just so damaging um, to supply in most cases, and demands in a couple. If for some reason, if you so check it out. With price controls, what are the logical options here? You're going to have the government choose the price directly the same as where the market would put it. Okay, in which case you did nothing and you're really freaking good at guessing what the market was going to do. That's magical. No. So most of the time you're either going to have a price too high compared to the market or a price too low compared to the market. And when I say compared to the market, I mean of what the market would have done without your price control, right? You don't even get to see what the market would have done without your price control. You hid that information from yourself by instituting a price control. So again, you're blinding yourself with the price control. But if you look at the evidence of the damage that you're doing, you might be able to unblind yourself. So if you institute a price control and there's not enough supply to meet the demand, then that means that you set the price too low to where you're not encouraging enough supply to meet the demand. On the other hand, if you set the price too high, what you can expect to see is that not enough people buy it. So you're going to see an oversupply. You're going to see this glut of extra high priced items that no one wants to buy. Ah, right. And the thing is, though, if they aren't buying that, they're buying something else. So, in a way, you can actually create inflationary pressure on other things just by price control setting one thing too high. And it's not the people that are buying it at the too high price that are causing the inflation. It's the people that are declining to buy it that are causing inflationary pressures on other goods and services. So, oh, yeah, this is a layer of complexity that most people aren't ready to talk about. And that's my point. Is that, notice, we haven't even talked about money printing yet. We literally just talked about what if the government instituted a price control on one item. Oh, uh-oh, they did. We just talked about that. What was that one item? Gold. So, of course, the nasty part there, that's a really selfish thing for the government to do when you think about it. Because if there's one thing that gives away the generic movement up or down, the value of a currency, it is the price of gold in that currency since before writing was invented, according to our best understanding. For the past, we'll just say, you know, 14,000 years, the most common observed standard of value for trade has been gold. Now, what's the second? Now this is a little bit edgy here. What are the second and third most common? Livestock and people that were some sort of servant or slaves, right? If you want to lump them together, that's a you thing. I consider them different enough because I'm in the camp that says that there are important categorical differences between humans and non-human animals. But I understand the people that want to lump them together. But that's the point, though, is that essentially the only thing competitive with gold throughout history has been livestock, human or otherwise, as far as long-term stores of value. And of course, like you say, well, wait a second. Why is it? Why is it that gold gets stuck in the same category as livestock? Because that's pretty bizarre. No, it really isn't. It's because it has so consistently been shown to be a source of profit if you can hold on to it and make use of it. And I mean, when you look at all of the uses for gold that it has, and then on top of that, you throw, in my opinion, complete psyop of a reason. But hey, man, like if it works, it works, right? It's pretty. It's pretty. Gold is decorative. It's so easy to work with because it's so soft. And then it's got all of these cool electronics applications. It's got all of these cool. So the point is, gold has just never become less valuable. And us trying to price control it to hide the difference in the value of our currency by having a gold standard, that's really crazy. And the people that want to argue, no, 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 that lets us calibrate and control and maintain the value of our currency compared to gold. No, it doesn't. There's especially as the world economy gets larger and larger, and within every country the economies are getting, pretty big depending on how you measure them. Maybe not the biggest ever depending on how you measured some of these places, but there's a lot of people. They're engaged in producing a lot of goods. They're engaged in producing a lot of services to each other. They have a lot of notional value in the properties that they've built. you know if you tried to draw an equivalence between all of the gold in the world and all of the stuff in the world, gold would be way, way more expensive than, you know, whatever it is right now, 2000, 2200 per ounce, something like that. But that's exactly it. Why don't we see more people selling gold? Because the price has been suppressed. And I say, because we see people trying to buy gold and they're like, oh, well, actually, what do they say? I'm not sure if I want to buy gold. No. What they say is, how much of my portfolio can I afford to put into gold? Because there's never like with stocks and stuff, you're always going to be like, wait a second, is this stock quality? Where is this stock going in the next few years? You look at the stock itself to see where it's going to go. But because of the role of gold in the economy, then you, gold's always good. The question is just, where's the price at? And you could say that maybe about some other commodities. Yeah, yeah, you could. And that's actually, if we were going to do a price control, if we were going to back our um our dollar with something, by far the logical choice would be oil. The petrodollar approach of the last few decades has been absolutely backwards of what I would consider to be good actor behavior, right? So what the petrodollar has been is, over the past, since Nixon basically, has been, anyone who wants to sell their oil in something priced besides US dollars basically receives illegal harassment from people involved with the CIA. It's not cool, guys. Like, I don't know a nicer way to say that. That doesn't make America friends, right? That doesn't help our place in the world to make some of our corrupt people that much richer by them using the force of our government to rip off third worlders. That doesn't help us. We should be opposing that, right? So again, to wrap up that part of the conversation there, we went from having dollars that were specifically tied to the government can make good on this stuff, and now we're up in, past Nixon, to where it's like the government ain't gonna make good on this stuff. right? Like not even play pretend. And then where are we at? So theoretically, you know, and I'm not going to go full modern monetary theory here. There's just I'm not going to take the time for it. If anybody cares, that's a great starting point. If there's a single voice that I think is the most reasonable on the topic of MMT, it's going to be Warren Mosler. Um, if you are a ANCAP or libertarian minded person, I would highly encourage you to go look up the talk that he did on Tom Woods. So again, Warren Mosler, Tom Woods. I want to say they had Robert Murphy on there. Great talk. But I'm gonna super summarize where MMT is coming from. Modern monetary theory looked at our current system that we have and said, classical economics does not describe how this works. Classical economics describes how hard currency, asset backed currency works. And I mean that broadly sweeping. Um, you know, both the Adam Smith side and the Karl Marx side of classical economics. Like they did all of the same types of studies into the gold standards, into how property actually works under governments compared um, to more naive ideas that were not well thought out, things like that. You got those basics in there, and then of course you get great insights later on from the Austrian school of economics, that just Ludwig von Mises and the rest got in there and just actually started describing human action, how humans actually make their decisions. And part of the very um, important point that Austrian school brought to the table is that these government numbers are garbage. It's echo chamber behavior. It is you have a lot of these numbers are practically determined by what you choose to measure. Like you can choose how to make the measurement to get the measurement that you want. And when it was realized by the Austrian school people that there was a lot of like self-serving deception going on, then it's just like, hey, let's just lay it on the table how it works, how it actually works. Instead of pointing fingers and whatnot, let's just look at how it actually works. And then of course they were happy to point fingers once they showed how it works and how socialism made it not work, right? But that was hard currency, right? That was asset backed currency. And so by the time that you get past Nixon, you get aspects of the economy that weren't there to study previously, right? And to the extent that, I mean, Austrian school still has plenty of important things to say about human action. What they don't have, because it wasn't around for them to study, was soft currency economics, how the economy runs differently, how the monetary system runs differently when your currency is based solely on the use value of your currency, right? Because at the end of the day, you say, well, what exactly is backing the US dollar today? And the answer is clearly not, it's backed by nothing. The answer is clearly, under the petrodollar paradigm, it's backed by the US military. That is to say, if there's a source of petroleum on the planet that isn't purchasable with US dollars, then there are people within the US government who will start taking action to try to rectify that situation. That's not preferable, but that is where we are, right? Now, if we didn't have the petrodollar, well, what's the difference then? right? And that is to say, what if tomorrow everybody but the US starts selling their petroleum, their oil, right? Their crude oil by the barrel in something other than dollars, right? And again, let's say everybody but us, just boom. At that point, what is it backed by? Well, obviously, it's backed by all of the goods and services that we're producing domestically. Hmm. Okay. And when you look at how that actually breaks down, where the dollars are running around every year in our economy, a disproportionate number of them are going to be caught up in what? In the government and related fields, right? And what has been one of the related fields in the private sector ever since the creation of the internet? Right. The internet and tech companies, right? The big social media companies, the big software companies, that are just getting all of this traffic that they are using to sell advertisements. So it's basically the advertising cartel is is a big part of our goods and services that is backing our dollars right now. Kind of trippy if you think about it. But again, what is it that America has that the rest of the world uh, needs from us? Right? There's commodities which we use plenty of, and by policy choices we can make more than we need or we can make less than we need. And when I say policy choices, again, like, oh, you sound like a central planner. No, I sound like the people in Washington ever, for since the days of FDR have already been engaged in central planning, and that it's dishonest to pretend like we all aren't already doing it. And I'm sorry, I am a bit of a technocrat. If we're not going to stop doing it, we should at least try to do it right. That's where I'm coming from. So you have a situation where the government is saying that, oh, yeah, the gold standard was supposed to be about like keeping us honest about how much money we're printing to not devalue the dollar. Well, so here's another big important point that we're going to run into, right? To not devalue the dollar too much, too much. Why? Because when you look at the way that the private economy actually works, right? The parts of the economy that are actually, have non-government customers in some sense or another, like that aren't direct. If you aren't directly got some sort of a contract with the government, you've got a different situation, right? If you got a direct contract with the government, you really only have to worry about keeping whoever your handler that you're working with in the government, whatever keeps them happy. You don't have to worry about what the general public thinks if you've got all of your income from government contracts. So that, to the extent that the government is doing stuff like that, it is shunting power away from the common people and towards these special interests that are, again, they're working with the government to get something done that the government wants done, and they're going to be overpaid for it in almost every case. And again, that's simple to understand because if they weren't getting on so if they weren't getting overpaid for it, then they wouldn't want to do it, right? Because you have to pay them at least as much as it's going to take given the risks. So you actually have to include risk pricing into something like that when you've got a government contract. And then you've got the game of, well, here's what's required to fulfill this contract. Guess what? When these people are writing up what's required to fulfill these contracts, they already have their companies in mind. So it's almost like a wild card if some other company somehow gets involved and tries to bid on a contract that was already designed for another company, right? So we've got these parts of our system that people want to argue are checks and balances, but when you look closely at them, they're literally there to look like a check and balance while allowing the corruption to continue. Okay? That's going to be a that's going to be a common theme here, right? So in the same way, we have okay, so we've got a Federal Reserve now. That's how that works. And you've got people that are still doing their deposits of their dollars that aren't gold anymore because they still buy things and they're still needed to pay the bills. And it doesn't look like that's going to change anytime soon, even if the dollar gets quite devalued over the next decade. There's no indication that people are going to stop using it. And if we did, because here's the other thing, if we do, it's going to be a choice. Because worst case scenario where someone isn't acting maliciously on our behalf would be that they would take the national debt, and to avoid further interest on the national debt, they would print it all and pay off all outstanding federal debt. Now, what would that actually do? That would be a one-time inflation of pricing, right? It would be a one-time inflation of pricing notionally, which would reduce the value of the dollar according to how many more dollars we're chasing the same good or service. There is absolutely, so again, I want to make sure that people have this understood. There's like this much actual like currency in the system, right? There is like massive amounts of debt. Again, maybe sorry, didn't really make it into the right, little bit of actual like quote money out there, big bit of notional dollars out there. Most of the dollars that people hold notionally, they're holding for the future. They don't need it this year. What they need to know is that in the future, if they need to spend dollars, they have those dollars. That's what they need to know, right? If they need to spend dollars in the future, they have those dollars. That's what matters to them. Okay, but those dollars have to be enough dollars to buy the things that they need. Okay, yeah, but again, how much they need is dependent on how much inflation there is. So it's connected in a feedback loop of sorts. And people are going to be looking at a situation where if today, if everybody just tried to spend all of their money, then that would be that doomsday scenario where the value of your dollars went to zero because everybody was looking to buy and nobody was looking to sell, right? Or another way to say this, everybody was trying to sell dollars for something else and nobody wanted to buy dollars. So that would indicate that, again, that for whatever reason, the dollar lost all of its value. Because even if somebody buys up all the dollars, what will that do for them? They're not they're not able to be redeemed for anything these days, are they? Okay. Well, can you start thinking of some reasons why that won't happen? Oh, I can. Most people find positive value in being able to go to the store and trade their dollars that they got for working for what they need to live. And they really didn't have a use for trading it for gold in the first place. Most people, if you gave them a piece of gold that was worth $2,000 and you said, you can keep this piece of gold that's going to be worth more, most likely more than $2,000 in a few years from now. Almost for sure, it's going to be worth more than $2,000 a few years from now because it's worth 2,000 today and we have a positive rate of inflation in our society right now. Every indicator, like, this isn't guesswork. This is one of the most stable trades ever, right? And you ask, how much is it worth to that person? To that person, not to the whole economy. Because as everybody who's being honest has pointed out, the base inflation rate for, or excuse me, the base interest rate for the entire economy, the discount, Federal Reserve discount window, is not a true measurement. It's a policy, right? It's a policy. And then you can measure the economy and see how that policy affected various parts of the economy. Part of the Federal Reserve's mission is price stability. And another part of their mission is keeping unemployment at around 5%. The thing is, their employment mandate of trying to keep unemployment at around 5%, of course, means that sometimes they're going to want to lower the rate at the discount window in order to have a knock-on effect on the whole economy of lowering the interest rates in order to make more money available for the starting and expansion of businesses, which results in more jobs being created and people being paid more in the aggregate, as in, like, the GDP number go up. Okay? But anytime that you're, like that, and that's the thing. Like, normally, if you just keep on adding GDP and you don't add any dollars, what we should expect to see is that each dollar is going to buy more stuff because it's going to buy the same percentage of an economy that's getting bigger, right? So if you have a set slice of a pie that's getting bigger, right? Then you bought in early and you were on that train, right? So the thing is, if there's literally no expansion, then when you get any slowdown, you get a really nasty dynamic known as debt deflation. So essentially, what will happen is that someone who took out a loan for their, let's say, for their business, right? Let's say you take out $100,000 loan to start your business, and you have you're looking at a 7% interest rate. You're gonna have to come up with $7,000 every year to pay that interest, right? And as long as the value of money is going down over time, if there's a positive rate of inflation, then the dollars that you're paying it back in are worth less than the ones you used or that you borrowed in the first place, which is part of why it is fair and in your interest and why you might be willing to agree to it that you're borrowing it to pay it back many more dollars in dollars that are less valuable. So the interest rate in that sense is a protection for the lender against inflation. Okay? Now, if you're a business who needs to keep inventory of some sort, or you need to have expensive machinery that you have to own to even service your customers, right? Then you're going out on a limb and you're putting out dollars because you now even though you know that the dollars that are being used to buy your goods and services are worth less than the dollars that you had to borrow to get yourself off the ground in the first place, or that you chose to invest in yourself. If you already had it, you could have lent it to someone else to run their business, and you didn't. You chose to run your own business, so you are still notionally up against that. Again, for sake of the example, we're calling it 7% interest, right? Whatever that number is, you've got to come up with that every year, or else you are notionally making less money than you would have if you would have just lent your money to someone else to run a business, which, especially considering that you put your blood, sweat, and tears into running the business, like, depending on whether or not you're paying yourself and all those details. Right, right. So the point is that when they go ahead and they choose to raise the interest rates, then it makes it more expensive to stay in business, and fewer firms are going to pull that off, especially because there's just less money running around, as a knock-on effect. And every time, for instance, every time because interest rates are high, that a loan does not get made because, oh, interest rates too high. I'm not interested. My business plan doesn't think it's going to come up with that much money. I don't want to take the risk in an environment where you've got all this economic slowdown, probably not the best environment to try to start a new business in. Oh, but that is economic slowdown. When one person doesn't start their business, and then the knock-on effect is that the next person and the next person and the next person also don't start their business. Now, that's not forever. What's supposed to happen in a relatively free market, if the actual market conditions, not the Federal Reserve mucking about in it, but the actual market conditions, to the extent that they are responding to a situation where people are choosing not to start businesses because it's a bad risk environment, the bad risk environment eventually snowballs into a crash where just massive reorganization of where the notional wealth of society is. And the unfortunate part is the way that it usually works out is that the people who had enough money and had enough prior notice that things were getting ugly would just dump most of their portfolio. A bunch of the people who are just saving for retirement and stuff, if they know what's good for them, they're just along for the ride. They're not buying or selling. So you've got all this selling activity, no buying activity. It's going to slam the market to lower valuations until eventually it's to where some people figure it's at enough of a discount to where they'll start buying it up. So again, unfortunately, this is an effect that concentrates the wealth of our society every time that the market slams to nothing, and then people who had money buy up the stuff at super low prices. You can see why some of us might want less of that, right? Okay. So, what's the other direction, though? The other direction is if the Federal Reserve, instead of them raising rates in order to cause more unemployment to try to get up to that 5% mark. And again, wait. Why 5% mark for unemployment? Why do you want to get up to 5%? I thought you said they were trying to keep it. Oh, no, I said they're trying to keep it at 5%, not keep it under 5%. They want to keep it at 5%. Because you see, if the way that it's figured by the people who made the rules for the Federal Reserve, if if unemployment is below 5%, that's too much upward pressure on wages. And that's the inflation they really care about is how much is it going to cost me as someone who already has my money to pay other people to do what I want them to do. Ah, yeah. No, it's a control tool. That's really what it is. And suppressing wages is going to be felt by the people whose wages are suppressed, similar to theft, right? They're going to say, listen, I'm looking at the government and I'm looking at how you guys have it set up. And I'm looking at it taking actions that are directly targeted towards making sure that people like me are paid less for the work that we've done than we would have if the Federal Reserve had not taken action. It's that simple. The math is there, and they're open about it. They've been open that like no. The whole point is that we want to avoid wages going up faster than the rate of general inflation, because the rate of general inflation is going to include assets that the rich are heavily invested into, like the stock market and real estate and all those sorts of things that are these assets that are valued in dollars. And when again, to the extent that we are lowering the interest rates and it increases the number of dollars out there, then that is raising the valuations of the assets that they were able to purchase in the past because they had dollars when other people didn't, and because they had dollars when other people didn't, and they used them to purchase these assets that are priced in dollars, the pricing of those assets is going to go up in dollars. That's a double-edged sword. Two, I mean, because again, like what happens? Price goes up because of monetary inflation as opposed to an increase of actual value, right? Like if you said, forget it's priced in dollars, price it in gold. What was its percentage price change in gold compared to dollars? And yeah, to me, I think that's a perfectly fair way of measuring inflation because gold is a more honest long-term stick of value, measuring stick of value than the dollar is. And that's exactly why I see a value in keeping them separate. And again, frankly, I would rather that oil was being more or less overproduced and subsidized for all sorts of reasons having to do with quality of life and national security. And on that basis, um, yeah, like I think that there's definitely when we're looking at these situations and we're seeing, okay, Could we get the government uninvolved? Because it's obviously heavily involved. What we're going to find is that in almost every case, even when there's people being hurt by the government involvement, what we also see is people who are being saved from disaster by government involvement, if for no other reason than the government started handling something for them. And they're like, oh, thank God I don't have to handle it anymore. And they didn't. And they focused their efforts and energies on in their lives on other things that the government wasn't already handling. So if you change a policy to where the government doesn't handle that anymore, those people are going to feel like it's a direct attack on them. And so, why did we end up here? What, what was the title of this video? The middle class has been lied to about inflation. I might change the title, but that's my working title at the moment. Why am I worried about the middle class? Great question. Number one, except for the very rich, which make up a very small percentage of the population, the lower, middle, and upper of the middle class are going to hold most of the wealth of society, again, except for the really rich, right? Because lower class on average is going to have a negative notional net worth on average. Most people are going to have at least a small amount of debt and less than $1,000 a month of discretionary income. Okay? I don't feel like that's controversial to say. Like, by the time, if you have $1,000 a month that you get to decide whether you're going to spend it on something or you're going to put it in the bank, like to me, that's at least lower middle class. Because the whole point is that you're not dependent on the government check coming in every month, or you're not dependent on your paycheck from someone that can fire you at any moment from coming in a couple of times every month, right? So, is it irrational for the lower classes to want stability past what their job is giving them? I don't think that's irrational at all. When they look at how the system has been used to help create and preserve the wealth of so many people that aren't them, they say, why can't the government act on my behalf? Am I not a citizen? Why do other people have this outsized benefit from the government compared to me? I don't think that if we're staying within the mind, that within the zone of being liberty minded, I don't think we have good answers for them. Right? I think that the answers aren't liberty minded. I think that the answers are control minded. When I talk to the middle class again and again, there's a worry amongst them that I don't have when I talk to actual, the bottom 50% of society. The middle class is petrified at the idea. Now realize this is a class of people who have enough money left to where they've been saving up for their retirement. This is a class of people who, on average, are either, you know, purchasing cars with cash, or choosing to take on car payments. Like these are people who a lot of the time have invested in businesses, in expanding their house or buying a new one. Maybe they even bought some sort of an improvement property to try to do a rental to try to improve their income. Middle class America is important and they do important things. That's why they have so much wealth. And that's a good thing. I want to be unequivocal about that. I I think that America purposely making sure that the people who develop their deep skill sets and do important jobs that other people can't do be handsomely rewarded in a way that lets them build for the future. Spot on. Good. That's part of the good part about America, okay? But what you've got to realize is that under that, you've got so many people that right now are barely profitable to employ. And I think it's important that we look at why. A lot of that is going to come from cost of living has been increased so much by various policies and regulations and such. And of course, to the extent that we're diverting our economy to having the government pay for things. And again, pay for it. What does that mean? Why do we care when the government pays for something? Number one reason we care about it is because literally they're having someone do what they want instead of whatever they were going to do instead. They're doing it voluntarily, theoretically, right? They're voluntarily taking the government's money and they are voluntarily um doing the government task for the money. So what's the problem? Well, if they weren't doing anything anyway, there really isn't a problem on that side. If they were going to do something for someone else, now that someone else doesn't get that thing done for them, right? If it was going to be competitive, the person doesn't have the choice on whether or not to compete to have that person do it. It's just not going to get done. So whatever that person was going to get paid to do didn't get done because the government paid them instead. But whoever was going to pay them also still has that money and they'll pay for something else to happen. It doesn't seem very high impact on that level. And when you say, well, what's the other half? The government has to pay, which means either they have to borrow or they have to tax. Well, again, same thing though. It's just that same, the government is grabbing a part of the economy and changing it. That's all it is, right? That is to say that whoever it can either sell a treasury bond, in which case some marginal buyer who wants to buy it will do so, or a bank will if the marginal buyer isn't there, because that's how the system is rigged right now. Like you don't get bonds that aren't bought. Like the banks, as long as it's a policy choice, then the banks will keep buying the bonds. The feds will keep buying the bonds from the banks. So my biggest pet peeve when I start talking about it would be good if we changed government policy in this way. Someone wants to ask, how are we going to pay for that? We're going to pay for it the same way that we pay for everything else that we pay for. We're going to have the government send out the dollars. We're going to have the people do the tasks in return for the dollars, right? Oh, oh, right. Like, there's just so much confusion and the difference between the government spending the money versus people spending the money. The difference of where's the government going to get the money? Like, no, governments aren't individuals. The government doesn't have to to find the money somewhere. And the other part, in case anyone's confused about, well, wait a second, uh, where will the dollars come from if they spend them without? And it's like, no, that's exactly it. Most dollars are literally totals in a computer somewhere. They're numbers. Most the ones that exist. And again, that's not the notional dollars that people are holding, that like, oh, someone owes me, that someone owes me, that someone owes me, like that we have this web of debt in the economy. That's not even counting that. Like, those are all notional dollars on top too, and they're important. But here's the thing: if you have someone owes you money, but they're paying you back over a course of 20 years, or they're paying you back at the end of the 20 years, that notional dollar is one that you were planning on saving for the next 20 years anyways. You weren't going to spend that. So you you know, what's the difference, right? If we had a negative rate of inflation, right? If we had deflation, then you could just shove that dollar under your mattress in 10 years, pull it out, and it'll buy more than it did 10 years ago. Well, what does that do to an economy? It's going to make no one want to spend their money. And all of the products are going to stay on the store shelves. And then, oh, except they can't, because a big part of what we buy is going to be things we need to survive, like food and energy, which are the two things that they specifically cut out of measuring so-called non-volatile inflation. And they say, oh, well, that's normal to have volatility in food and and energy. Oh, and what's the big third one that we all need? Housing, right? And what's the other one that we can't not spend on? Healthcare. And what's the one that they try to pretend that we can't not spend on? College education. Notice the things that we just don't have a choice to spend less on are the things that the price just, it's not just that it always goes up. It's that it's going up at a disproportionate rate. It's got a different trend line than the other goods and services that we're trying to assess here in the inflation. These items have different rates of inflation. The headline inflation numbers that they're giving you aren't actually measuring the things that I would argue that we should care about. So, what's the inflation that we should be caring about on average? Well, on average, we should care about the system working. We should care about things like when a business makes a purchase of goods to have delivered to it so that it can sell it to the public. It makes sense to me that they should know that the value of those goods won't have dropped in dollars because the dollars got more valuable during the process of them spending them and the products showing up. You can't run a profitable business like that. You cannot run a profitable business in an environment where the what you're spending is becoming more valuable. And I'm going to throw out, that's one of my biggest things that I think is going to limit Bitcoin as a transaction heavy instrument, as opposed to a like, that's the thing. Like, Bitcoin is essentially deflationary. And you'll notice that most people want to own it and hold on to it and essentially to speculate with it. They only want, because they know it's not going anywhere. They know the longer that they hold it, the more the price is likely to go up. And that if the price goes down temporarily, it's only temporary because there's only one direction for it to go. And that direction of it being worth more and more over time causes people want to hold it longer. Now, does it also mean that they'll be willing to acquire it? Potentially. But what unless they're wanting to hold it forever, essentially what they're going to do is that they might take it in payment, but then they're going to sell it right away for something that's easier to transact in, right? And once they have something that's easier to transact in, then what are they doing? They're buying something that they actually want to use, or they're investing in something else. But again, like that's the point, is that Bitcoin, and again, full disclosure, I own approximately $1,000 of Bitcoin. Approximately. Like, I have no intention on selling it this year. I literally just want to own a chunk of that monetary system in case the one that I'm in falls apart. But you'll notice I don't have high hopes for its usability. Like, it's Bitcoin was made to be saved. The US dollar was made to be spent, especially the Nixon, post Nixon US dollar. Now, who's the elephant in the room that we're kind of like getting nervous about? What if the Federal Reserve US Central Bank went ahead and switched to notionally digital dollars where dollars essentially each had their own ID number in the central bank system, almost like you have as many accounts as there are dollars, and that those accounts are assigned to people is almost how I think I would describe it as working. But the idea is you've got dollars that exist, and then they have ownership assigned in the central bank computer to whoever notionally owns them. And the idea, of course, is that this would essentially eliminate economic behavior that the government didn't approve of, like crime. We don't trust our governments that much. We shouldn't trust our governments that much. Um, Now, if our governments don't trust us that much, that brings up some interesting questions of who owns this place, right? But I don't think we need a central bank digital currency. And I think that it would introduce all sorts of problems. And that's why I find it that much more of a fallacy when people try to bring it up when I start talking about universal basic income and the problems that it would solve. The fact of the matter is, middle class, when inflation occurs, that is to say, when new dollars are created, right? When monetary inflation occurs, when new dollars are created, that house asset that's already in your name, which again, you might still owe the bank a lot of money for, depending on your situation. If that value goes up, then you just notionally got richer. You have more dollars available at your disposal in equity in your house, right? And that also means that it might be taxed higher if it's seen as more valuable. Government likes doing that. And similarly, if you were to sell it, on your primary residence, you mostly won't face any sort of capital gains taxes, but you might be looking at something like that. And of course, sales tax tends to exist, but you're probably looking at some sort of an increased taxation, even if you were just planning on owning that house for the rest of your life, and you're never going to pay capital gains on it or whatever. You're still going to have to deal with, if it's worth more, you'll have to pay higher taxes because that's how the system is set up, right? Okay. And again, similarly, if you go out and you, let's say that you do have hundreds of thousands of dollars of equity in your house, and you go down and you just say, oh, that's fine. I want to cash out some of my equity. Go ahead, throw a second mortgage on that. Give me 50 grand, whatever. And then you spend that 50 grand. Then, number one, it's inflationary because you're just spending money that wasn't loose out in the economy before. But that so-called wealth effect of your house is worth more on paper, you go ahead and you take out leverage against it, and now you have cash and you can buy the things that you needed to with cash, which there's now an additional buyer in the market with a bunch of money for these goods. Only those goods are, though. That's the important part people need to realize. Whatever that person was buying because they borrowed the money on their house, that those goods specifically are the only ones that are going to get inflationary pressure, and they're going to get not a proportionate amount to what part of the economy make up. They're going to get a proportional amount to what proportion of the money spent is headed in their direction. And again, taxation will occur, and the government says thank you because, oh, how did we print? How did we pay? Oh, this is great. How did we pay for this? How we paid for it was that when we spent the money into the economy, most of it came back in taxes. That's how we paid for it. And if we were worried that not enough of it came back in taxes, we could raise taxes, and that would suppress economic activity. Or if we were worried that we suppressed economic activity too much, we could lower the taxes, and that's going to increase economic activity on average, right? And the problem is, so many of the doofuses that want to get involved with central planning do not understand how connected these things are. They do not understand that stacking up multiple factors that point in one direction can completely swamp out factors that are pointing in another direction at certain scales, and that at other scales that will never happen. That you have directionality that is so big in certain subsections of what we're working with that you're never going to get it to work the other way. And that's what I'm trying to emphasize to anyone who's still confused and think that our economy can survive any amount of deflation. One of the biggest consequences of a slowdown in inflation would be that the federal debt would become notionally more when priced in gold. The federal debt would be notionally more when priced in oil. If the right now the US government is such a debtor in its own dollars that it gives itself budget relief on its debt payments in a way that matters to how it runs. It would not be able to run with smaller numbers. The numbers must go up every year. They must. That's a shape of the system. And I'm not gonna have the time in a single video to go through the shape of these numbers and all of them stacking up on each other. I've been tempted to write a whole ass book. Instead, I'm taking a couple hours out of my afternoon. It is not viable to allow deflationary conditions. There must be inflation. Think about this. Every day that goes by, there are debts that are accruing interest. Unless the number of dollars in existence increases at a faster rate than the percentage of the economy that's being paid out towards interest on existing debt, you're going to get defaults. And again, what are defaults doing? They are notionally destroying money. They're saying this thing where this guy owed you $800, never gonna happen. Forget about it. And the moment that that information gets out to, the relevant third party, then it's like, oh, you don't really have this $800 that you have invested in this thing. Your investment went bust. You don't have $800 anymore. Boom. Like, forget a haircut. Forget, oh, we're only going to pay you back 90 cents. Boom. Well, boom's bad. You look back at 2008, and that was one of the big problems, is that you had people buying these stupid credit default swaps and CDO squareds, which is where you do a credit default swap on a credit default swap. And so what that meant was that you'd have you'd have your tranches of mortgages that were supposedly rated AAA, which really meant, because of the dirty way they were doing it, that most of them were AAA, and you had some bad ones in the mix. And then you have, again, the CDO squared, where it's like, okay, so CDO is if everybody gets paid off first and you're the last one to get paid off, but you get all the monies. Like, seriously, that's how it's set up, is to where the safest tranches get paid first. And then if the money ain't there for the riskiest tranches, they don't get it. But if they do, they could get pretty rich. Like, they could get good money compared to how much they invested. And there was a lot of that crap going around in 2008, and some of it was without proper consent with some of the wealth managers. But that's a secondary criminal corruption issue. Even to the extent that you had, the people that were voluntarily engaging in this stuff. What that means is that the moment that even 10% of people are having problems with paying their debt, it can cause people who've put themselves in riskier situations to get completely wiped out. Even if someone else is getting wiped out for 10%, if you've put your full exposure to the high risk situation and you get wiped out, you get wiped out. Like, there's too many people in that position. And I understand that there's an attitude among the middle class that, well, they fucked up. They invest in the wrong things. That's a them problem. Except that these them problems don't stay them problems. These things affect us systemically. And in the same way that it affects us all in a big way when millions of young people are deceived into taking out massive, unforgivable student loans, like, this is something that affects us too. And it's not unreasonable for us to make sure that the force of the law, the force of the government, is on the right side of these issues. on treating people justly, treating people according to the Constitution, etc. And unfortunately, there has been an attitude over the past 100 years that banks are special enough that they shouldn't have to follow the same rules as other aspects of the economy. And let me just say, I agree. We clearly, under our current system, are running banks much more like utilities than we are competitive market oriented businesses. Banks are literally by law not allowed to compete on their core offerings. They can do is compete on customer service and what their service fees are. They are so regulated that if you want to do banking differently, you can't do it because the government has become so involved and has the whole field so not just so regulated, but so formulaically regulated to where on a cover your own liability basis, you can't do it differently from other people. And when you say, well, where did that scaredy cat attitude come from? Well, go back to the 2000s, where what happened was that they did let people get creative with investment offerings. And again, what you found is that whenever they said, hey, look, you still have to follow the rules, but we're taking off the safeguards that would automatically catch you if you didn't, people don't follow the rules. Like consistently they don't. Like so that's why people like me, when I hear about them doing things like, oh, you don't think you need election security, reliably someone's going to cheat. The more that they're sure that they're not going to get caught, the more likely that they're going to cheat. And so when you had situations with these ratings agencies, they you had to look at the incentive structure. The incentive structure was, if a ratings agency chose to not rate an instrument for a big bank the way that they wanted them to, they could develop a reputation for not being friendly or cooperative, and then the banks would avoid them and they would go out of business, while the ones that were willing to play ball and to rank things correctly would be the ones that stay in business. And of course, that's only possible because of how hard it is to start your own bank, to compete with banks, with all of the barriers to entry that include regulation that keeps you from innovating and doing it in a different way. Yeah, which you can do some of the same activities as a bank, as a private individual, but you're going to find that different laws apply and that different protections apply for you as an individual and all the rest. Okay, so enough of that side conversation there, but again, emphasizing, even if deflation is not a problem for you in your own life, the problems that it causes other people in their lives will be a problem for you, right? Deflation will wreck. Like, if I understand if you don't want to do a deep dive on the economics of it because you care about what works for your life, I respect that. I'm telling you, as someone that has spent a huge amount of the last decade getting very deeply familiar with a huge variety of perspectives and opinions on the economy, regardless of the root economics, which again I'm barely able to touch on it on in this video, right? regardless of those root economics, when people's lives stop working for them, they will impose costs on those around them. It's a big problem that we have younger generations that have worse prospects than previous generations did at the same age, because they say, why should we preserve your system if your system doesn't work for us? That's where we're at. There is no, we have 10 years to fix this. Things have already started degrading. And in way too many parts of our society, it absolutely will give you the whole, Ayn Rand Atlas Shrugged type of like, oh my God, did they just let that fall apart? Like, what? What? Why would they not prioritize keeping that working? Is there not someone capable? Right? And the thing is, at every level of society, like, that's the other thing is, of course, the whole thing about like people that get it in their head that they uh, and that's the funny part. Like, most of these things are just get it in their head. People get an idea, and by the time that they realize that the world isn't like that, it's too late. They've already made mistakes. They've already harvested the fruit of those mistakes. Well, that's where we are, though, right? We're at a place where the government is increasingly, with their fixes for one problem, they're breaking something else. It's not avoidable unless we decide collectively that we're going to stop solving problems with the government, which, then let's talk about that for a second. Again, notice I've heard the argument, oh, well, it's all the middle class, only the middle class votes, anyways. Only the middle class votes, anyways. That's all you have to worry about. False. I mean, it'd be false, anyways, but it's hugely false given that every election that goes by, places like New York and California and Arizona are trying to change the rules to make it easier and easier to get people that essentially don't even speak English to have their votes collected by people who are political activists. Like, this isn't going away. They're way. So here's the question: given that our economy more and more is tilted in ways that are trying to make the lower classes dependent on the government, you've basically got two ways forward. Well, you've got an imaginary third way, but let's talk about the two real ways forward. First real way forward is that you let people get more marginalized by bad policy until they're just so economically screwed that they vote for anyone who's going to give them a handout. That's not good politically, and you know it, because that's where we get the kind of hucksters like the Democrats that we've been getting, that are essentially, they say nice things to the lower class and then they're servants of the government sector labor unions and the banks and anyone else who can buy them, military industrial complex, etc. If the Republicans could actually be the ones to say, let's scrap this $1 trillion worth of government programs that are piecemeal, that are paying people to do stuff, like means test people to see whether or not the government should help them. No, screw all that. Just do universal basic income. Let the private sector handle it. Let the market price things, given that the government is giving everybody $1,000 at the beginning of every month. There will be positive inflation. There will be. And that will be good for businesses. And if you're in the middle class, it will it will grow your wealth as a percentage of all wealth if you put any if number one, you again, to the extent that you're going to get it too, that's a good safety net, right? For those of you who literally do have 50 grand cash in your bank, you don't care, and I respect that. For those of you who are finally happy because you scraped together the down payment for your house working those 48-hour weeks at the factory, number one, if we have UBI and you just keep working your job, you're probably going to make more per hour at your job. The amount that you owe on your house doesn't go up. Hi, I'm appealing to your blatant self-interest here. You don't get to say, oh, but this is an attack on. No, no. If we instituted $1,000 a month universal basic income for every adult citizen 18 and older, your debt that you owe on your house that's already in your name would shrink in the number of hours that you have to work to pay it off. And you say, wait a second, that's got to screw someone over. Who's that hurting? I'll tell you who it hurts. It hurts the people that are lending the money. They can afford to get hurt because the format in which they're being hurt is very specifically bounded by the amount of money that they've lent. And it was always part of the deal. It was always part of the deal that there was a default risk. That's part of why the interest rates are different. Because if the default risk was the same for everyone, then the interest rate would be the same for everyone, theoretically speaking. The at least as stated to the public, which there's definitely some different reasons that you could come up with, but at least as far as stated to the public, the reason why we even have why do we have positive interest rates? Let's start there. Well, let's see. You definitely have to pay people to let you hold their dollars, because if you pay them to hold your dollars, okay, but who can actually afford to do such a crazy ass thing as pay people to hold their dollars? Well, the US government, of course. But why do we want to do that? Why would we want to pay people to hold their dollars instead of to spend them or to invest them? Oh, wait a second. I think we half answered our own question, didn't we? So investing, initially it's a spend, right? But the point is you're buying to hold, right? You're buying and holding. That's the point of investing in that sense. So, or what? Or spend it on something you're going to consume. Oh, well, this looks like we're back to like the whole personal versus private, the whole spending to consume versus spending for exchange versus, right? Which in this case, it's spending to generate for exchange, right? So what we've got here, if we're trying to be rational about it, what do we actually expect is going to happen if we institute a UBI? What we should actually expect to happen is people who were only working because they had to or they were going to starve will stop working. This is a much, much, much smaller segment of society than people probably imagine it is. Because again, you have these middle class people who have it in their head that there's just this, that all of the people that do all of the things that they need to survive wouldn't be willing to do that if you gave them $1,000 a month. There's a big problem with this idea, which is that, notice, we're not giving them $1,000 a month to stop doing what they're doing. We're giving them $1,000 a month without regard to what they're doing. Which means that if they're going to choose different employment choices, then it's only because they now have the upgraded knowledge that they have that $1,000 a month to fall back on in the case where they have to spend some time without an employer. Because as long as every employee has to have a job or else they're screwed, and it is Federal Reserve policy to try to keep 5% of all workers at any given time screwed, oh, you're going to see wages go up, but not across the board. Why not? Because what we're actually going to see is who was being coerced into working versus who was working in a situation where they aren't making that much money, but where they're voluntarily doing that because they want the money from doing it, right? Because what we're going to see is someone like me, if we got universal basic income, I don't foresee employment changes. Like I literally I would be like, cool, I don't have to change my job now. Like if anything, the argument is going to be essentially, well, it's going to be harder to find people to work for me now, which, well, yes. Okay, but that's going to drive up prices, all other things equal. Yes. Well, I can't afford higher prices. Okay. So let's start here. What can you do to lower the cost of hiring employees? Well, under the current system, it's actually really rough because essentially you've only got one way to compete, and that's up, right? Because you've got just everybody needs their dollar amount, and about the only thing in most cases you can do is offer a bigger dollar amount. Oh, wait a second, except not quite. Because actually, when you look at some of the biggest companies that are most sought after to work for, a lot of what they're offering is something non-monetary. And that's where I'm going to start wrapping up this talk, because obviously we haven't talked about everything. And I certainly haven't even tried to make a full-blown case for universal basic income and won't try to cram that into this episode. But when I have people who say, but how will we pay for it? Bro, look at the way that the system is set up. That's a nonsense question. We just spent over 90 minutes going through details of the system, showing that they automatically adjust. These are dynamic systems. The market, this label, quote, the market that we use is over all this different stuff, right? So you have a situation where the middle class believes, because it's been lied to, it believes that 7% year over year inflation would be making them poorer. When the truth is, it almost completely matters what they want to buy. Because if what they want to buy is outside of the set of like daily needs for humans, most of the money ain't going there. Okay? Most of the money that is going to be spent on any given year, unless we are really, really, really rich as a society, is going to be for stuff that people need. It's going to be for housing. It's going to be for food. It's going to be for energy, for heating and transportation and refrigeration. It's going to be for healthcare. It's going to be for fake needs like education credentials, when we all know that there's way more economically effective ways to do education than our today's public school system and university system. People don't seem to get like whatever money, like if if you want goods and services to be created more than they are right now, the price has to go up. If prices go down, we will get fewer goods and services created. That's the way the market is supposed to work. We have choices moving forward, and I'm not expecting. Again, I'm a cynic like this on this particular issue. My expectations is that for the next, let's say hopefully 4 years of a second Trump administration, I don't think that Republicans are actually going to get on the right page here. And that's absolutely part of why I'm holding out the possibility of supporting a different party in the future than the Republican Party if they can get their act together on economics while also not screwing over civil liberties. Because I'm really, really grateful that the Trump revolution has cleared up like 80%, roughly speaking, of civil liberties issues in the Republican Party. 80% isn't everything. And that last 20%, let me tell you this. By the time that we got to 2015, I literally voted against Hillary twice, right? 2016, I voted against her in the primary. I actually voted for Bernie Sanders, which is funny for all sorts of reasons. But in the primary, I'm like, you know what? I don't think Bernie Sanders can win a general election, but if he can, better than Hillary, unironically. I always planned on voting for the Republican in general. Sure enough, yeah, and that was the other thing. I knew Trump was going to win at that point on the primary, right? Because by the time that it was up to me to vote, nobody was in there who actually factually could beat Trump, regardless of whether they would be preferable as the president. So if the Republican Party wants, I mean, keeping people like me is almost secondary. If the Republican Party wants people who are getting the short end of the stick from globalization, if they want the upper lower class to keep voting Republican and to not split off to a third party or a new second party when one shows up, when if and when we can finally finish scattering the ashes of the Democratic Party, like if they want to keep us in the future and keep our votes and keep our allegiance, they're gonna have to take a serious look at replacing us spending all of this corruption money on these government sector labor union workers to means test government programs and replace that and the lie that is Social Security. I don't have time to talk about all the ways in which Social Security is a lie in this video. It is. Look, wake up call. I understand that 2 hours of me talking to you about the last 100 years isn't the same as you going through the journey that I did to actually learn the economics. And I understand most of you are not going to make that journey. And I respect that in the same way I'm never going to be the gardener that you are. I'm never going to be the portrait painter that you are, whoever you are, right? But I did this. I spent well over a decade becoming brutally familiar with the systems that we refer to as economics. I think it's really important that humanity keeps most of itself in economic systems that do work. And we just, with the corrupt people that we have in our so called left of center party in the United States and throughout most of the Western world, we do not have the good people that actually want to help everybody in places of political power on the left. We do not. We have fake, corrupt people who do not, for the most part, actually believe in the egalitarian causes that they have like freaking stickered onto their shoulder. And this is child's play to point out if you can point at what are the actual interests of these disadvantaged groups and like what is the politician actually doing to help them out. My challenge to you as I leave you at the end of this video, you need to start watching out for when Republicans are going to try to tell you that inflation is worse, the inflation that comes from curing something is worse than the sickness to begin with. And all I can do is point out the fact that they are protecting you from having your assets become less owned by them with their partial claims of home mortgages. Okay? So that's important. Again, I will probably make some time to talk about some other classes and how they're more affected by inflation. But frankly, most of the people on my friends list that had this particular set of concerns, and I really feel like we needed to have this conversation. Yeah, I mean, they're middle class people who they understand. And again, I'm now talking more about them than that them. Hi guys, love y'all. They understand that they they get that the world only works because they show up to work every day. But the thing is, they have no faith that you're like them. They have no faith that all y'all that aren't middle class will actually keep being productive citizens if someone doesn't hold a gun to your head and say, work or starve. I reject that. I know a lot of lower class people And I have over the years. And the fact of the matter is, the only way we will ever lose the majority of people being willing to pitch in and do what needs done is if we as a society break the idea that there's a reason to do something other than being paid for it. And frankly, it would not bother me if more people were more willing to pay each other for things. But that will never happen until we give everybody a starting amount of money every month to vote towards each other. Right now, the lower class doesn't get to buy things from each other. They're restricted to barter because they don't have the dollars to pass back and forth. But you have people that are unemployed. You have people that aren't currently getting paid to do things. And you have other people that need things done. And the barrier between that happening is essentially the government. And the essentially the way that the tool that actually keeps that like that is the dollars that one of them doesn't have to give to the other one. And like I said, I'm going to wrap it up because I'm coming up on 2 hours here. And again, I I hope what you got out of this video is a deeper understanding of how monetary inflation is not one thing and that you should always question and double check when someone insists that solving a problem that you see as concerning is going to have worse costs than the problem itself. Because at that point, you should say, am I confused about what's important? Or is someone lying to me? Keep thinking for yourself, people. Thank you for taking the time, any of you that you did. I appreciate it. Go do the right thing, live your lives, be blessed. Take care.